Knees out is a common cue used by coaches to improve squatting. But this might not be the best cue for most people, and in fact, what's even crazier is this cue could be holding you back from achieving your best squat. So in this video, we'll reveal what's wrong with knees out and what to do instead. And to begin to understand the solution, let's start with the optimal biomechanics of a squat. When you squat, there's an optimal position and timing of your body through space. These positions allow you to stay balanced so you can hit depth and produce force. All else equal, achieving these positions at the right time will give you your best squat. Now the squat features a fixed foot, making it a closed chain exercise. This means that what the foot does impacts everything else above it from the ground up. If the foot can't achieve the proper motions and shapes, then everything above suffers. And when we look at the foot and ankle, we have two motions and shapes that we need to be able to access. As you descend into the squat, the ankle bends into dorsiflexion. The pressure in the foot shifts slightly to the inside of the foot, and the foot should flatten. This flatter shape is called pronation. Now, pronation is going to allow the knee to move maximally over the foot, and this allows the knee to bend as it moves forward and provide the opportunity for the hip to move back. The action of the knee moving forward as the hip shifts back is what allows the body to stay centered over the middle of the foot. And staying centered over the midfoot is what produces an upright squat pattern. This allows you to get the most out of your squat, effectively loading the quads and the glutes. Now, on the way back up, the opposite motions occur. Pressure in the foot shifts back towards the outside, and the foot becomes more arched, a shape known as supination. As this happens, the shin is going to move back, and the knees and hips will straighten. Now, the problem with the cue knees out is that it disrupts these natural shapes and positions. It keeps pressure on the outside part of the foot as we descend. And remember, we need the pressure to shift to the inside during this phase. And if we can't, we'll lose access to full ankle mobility. And this loss of mobility at the ankle sets off a cascading effect. The lack of ankle mobility means the knee can't move all the way forward. The inability of the knee to move forward causes the hips to stay too far back. And to counteract this, you'll need to lean the upper body forward. This creates a squat that either looks like a rounded upper body or more like a hinge and creates the common sensation of falling backwards. So if you struggle to squat to depth or have limited ankle mobility, you'll know these feelings all too well. Now, a funny little aside is that you're going to see this being even more of an issue in those with especially high arches. And when I used to do injury pre-screens for dancers, who tend to have high arches, most of them would actually fall backwards at the bottom of their squat. Now, this is kind of funny because when it comes to mobility, we think of dancers as being at the top of that proverbial food chain. But when you consider how they use their knees during movement, they're often using either cues or positions of knees out. So, with what we've discussed so far, this limitation should actually make sense. All right, so we're going to get to the actual solution in a second, but first we have to clear up a point of confusion that you might already be thinking about. And that is, if knees out is so bad, then why do some coaches use it, and why does it seem to work in some cases? Well, the nuance here is that another common cause of limited squat depth is a lack of hip mobility. As we descend into the squat, we need to be able to access motion at the hip. An inability to move at the hip results in limited depth or butt wink. Butt wink, if you're not familiar, is when the lower back rounds at the bottom of a squat. And the reason for both limited depth and/or butt wink is that the hip joint has run out of space too early as we've descended in the squat. During the descent, the motion at the hip is internal rotation and flexion. Now, we'll often see that we're going to max out this internal rotation and flexion too early if we begin in a narrow and/or parallel stance. Now, we'll talk about the theory in a second, but you can experiment with this by playing with the degree of toe out in your squat and doing a couple reps right now. Start with your feet about shoulder width apart. Then turn your knees and feet out about 5 to 10 degrees and squat down. As you do this, once again, make sure that the knee tracks directly over the middle part of the foot. Then do it again at about the same width, but with knees and feet facing forward. If you're like most people, you're going to have much better depth with the knees and feet pointing slightly outward. And there's good reason for this. The reason is that this toed out position starts the leg in a position of external rotation. And as the leg moves over the foot, we access this outward position of abduction. This creates space that you can then move into as you approach the bottom of the squat. When we look at the hip, external rotation positions the femur towards anterior glide. If you look here, you can see how the ball is rotating forward in the socket. As we descend, we're going to access flexion and internal rotation, and these require the opposite, which is posterior glide. So as we come down, this initial position of anterior glide creates room to then move into posterior glide. So long story short, the reason knees out works is because it creates space. But the important thing to realize is that this should be a position that you use as part of your setup. It should not be an action that you cue during the movement itself. All right, so now that we have that out of the way, let's discuss the solution to the knees out cue. I'd like to interrupt this video briefly to let you in on a way for you to learn all the skills you need to move and feel your best. My Movement Foundations programs are now available. Inside, you'll learn the foundational skills that you need to become a movement master. So go check those out from the link in the description, and now back to the video. All right, so how do we hit depth without knees out? To fix this, regardless of the stance, we need to allow the knee to track directly over the middle of the foot. At the top, we want to have pressure in the outside part of the foot as well as the base of the big toe. You'll often hear this referred to as the tripod foot. Now, as we move down, we're going to maintain pressure in all of these areas, but allow a subtle shift. This shift should be pretty natural, moving to the inside on the way down and back to the outside on the way up. But it's really not something you have to try to do, but instead something that should just happen all on its own. So just to clarify once again, if you want to squat to depth, don't push the knees out, but the knees are allowed to move out as a natural consequence of the alignment of your setup. All right, so what if this doesn't work for you? And it's at this point in the video, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the few exceptions. And those are if you're someone who sets up with your knees pointing straight ahead, or if you're using a super wide stance. In these cases, you might have to push the knees out in that initial phase of your descent. But at the bottom, you still need to allow a shift of pressure towards the inside part of your foot. In these cases, what we're actually up against is the opposite problem. It's too much pressure on the inside part of the foot too early. Now, if this sounds like you've got two options. The first is just to disregard this video completely. And if you're already squatting to full depth in a wide stance or with your knees pointing straight ahead, then go for it. But if you're not hitting full depth, you might want to adjust your setup and see if it helps. If you're using a wide stance, consider narrowing just a bit. And regardless of if you're narrow or wide, position your feet at about 5 to 10 degrees of toe out. Allow the middle of your knee to line up with the middle of your foot. And then as you go down, allow the knee to travel over the middle part of the foot. You're going to find if you set up this way, there's no need to push your knees out, and you'll likely hit better depth. All right, so now you understand the influences from the ground up. But what if you're still having difficulty? We all know the body functions as an interconnected system. So while the squat starts at the ground, the core and upper body can influence what happens below. So if you're still struggling, you've likely got some gaps in movement above. For example, you'll struggle if you can't access anterior pelvic tilt and back extension. You also need to be able to brace your core and expand your rib cage. So if you want to learn all the movements you need to squat to depth, then check out my Movement Foundations programs. Inside, you'll learn the foundational movement skills that you need to move and feel your best. You won't have to worry about figuring out what movements to do. It's all in there for you in 3 separate step-by-step progressive 4-week programs. We use biomechanical principles that you can apply to master any movement. So go ahead, check those out from the link in the description below. That does it for this video, so thanks so much for watching, and until next time, peace.